Just 37 minutes before takeoff, in the dim, yellow light of the flight crew corridor at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Captain Ethan Cole, a black man with 18 years of flying experience, walked quietly to the internal door, pulling out his familiar employee badge. It should have taken only a few seconds until a white flight attendant, Karen Mills, blocked the way. Her voice was low but cold. "I need you to show me more identification." Ethan, with the calm demeanor of someone who had dealt with an engine fire in midair, gave the airline-approved training schedule. But Karen didn't look closely or tried not to. She pressed the radio, saying in a voice that didn't waver, "We have an unidentified individual attempting to enter a restricted area." Less than 3 minutes later, 2 police officers appeared. No one yelled, no one raised a hand. But in that silence, something cut to the bone. A young black boy, walking by with his mother, stopped short at the sight. His eyes were wide, reflecting the childish confusion of seeing someone who looked like his father treated like a stranger in his own home. A few feet away, an African-American janitor stopped mopping, tilted his head slightly, watching. His eyes had grown accustomed to this silence. No one intervened. No one asked why. There was only a long silence, the most silent and terrifying truth of all. Why, just because of his skin color, is a pilot who once brought peace to thousands of passengers being suspected in the very cockpit where he has been attached for nearly 2 decades? If you were that boy, what would you think about the dream of flying? If you were the mother holding her son's hand, would you have the courage to speak up? And if you were Ethan, not just the pilot, but the father, the man who learned to hold the plane steady in a storm, would you have kept quiet? Let me pause for a moment, not just to see a man in a pilot's uniform, but to look at how we treat each other in the smallest of moments. Are you, the one listening to this story, willing to step in and feel with me? Dallas-Fort Worth Airport is not yet fully awake. The internal corridor leading from the crew rest area to the co-pilot is almost empty. The marble floor echoes with each lonely step, not of a passenger, but of a man in an ash-gray shirt and neat khakis, dragging a neat black suitcase. Ethan Cole, 38, had ditched his usual uniform for a simple gray shirt and dark khakis. Today was not a commercial flight, but an urgent training mission, requested by the airline near midnight. He didn't complain, nor did he give any advance notice. That was how Ethan lived, quiet, methodical, and always ready for work. With nearly 2 decades of experience in the air, appearing in civilian clothes in the internal areas was no longer unusual. But for some people, some looks, it never seemed to be enough. He pulled his small suitcase with him, reached the internal checkpoint, the one reserved for pilots and flight attendants, and paused to prepare to swipe his access card. Everything was routine. No rush, no deviations, nothing unusual, except for the sudden sharpness in the eyes of a person standing at the end of the hallway, almost as he raised his hand to swipe his keycard. Karen Mills, a flight attendant who had joined the crew less than 3 weeks earlier, walked toward him as if sensing danger. Her face was bright, her confidence fueled by a sense of right and wrong. But her eyes held a suspicion that came not from a mistake, but from a presence. Karen didn't look at the badge, didn't check the itinerary, didn't check the photo. The first thing she noticed was the color of his skin, which made her tense her face, straighten her back, and brace herself for intervention. Something inside her believed that the presence of a black man in the cockpit, even with all his paperwork, was suspicious. Less than 10 seconds later, Karen took the initiative to report. Her voice came through the intercom, firm and clear as if she were reading a statement. No one asked her for more evidence. She didn't see the need for it. Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't the type to argue or raise his voice. But there was a simmering suffering in his stillness, not from one specific situation, but from 1,000 small, prickly situations that had accumulated into a habit of silent suffering. The janitor at the end of the hallway also stopped and watched silently. A mother with a small child walked by and quickly slowed down. The boy looked up at the man who was blocking his way with a puzzled look. In the silence of the hallway, no one spoke, but everything was clearly felt. The atmosphere was not so tense that it could be cut with a knife, but it was so thick that no one wanted to breathe heavily. The card reader light turned green. signaling a valid pass. But Karen stood in front of the door, as if the color of the light didn't matter as much as how she felt. No proof was needed, just a hunch. Or rather, a subtle prejudice planted long ago. And there, in the middle of the long, empty corridor, the veteran pilot stopped, not because he did not have the right to continue, but because he knew that right, for some people, had never truly belonged to him. The soft yellow light of the cabin was gentle, but could not soothe the gradually suffocating atmosphere around Ethan. Eyes passed by, first curious, then gradually turning to unease and sometimes hidden anger. A few passengers quietly rolled their eyes, sensing the abnormality spreading through the normally quiet interior of the flight. In row 3A, a white couple exchanged slightly trembling glances, as if wondering about the story before them that they dared not enter. The husband, with a faint smile on his lips, whispered, "He looks polite. Why is he being treated like that?" The sentence did not need to be spoken aloud to carry the weight of sympathy. It was a silent voice, reflecting a conflict deeper than any explanation. Ethan, standing in the midst of that gaze, did not lose his composure. His composure was like a solid wall against the tide of injustice. He stepped back gently, pulling out his phone, not to protest, but to record the truth of this moment, a testimony to something that would be undeniable. Karen, still disdainful, glanced at him with a sarcastic smile. "Call who? Call your comrades?" Her voice was high and broken, as if to sow more seeds of doubt in the hearts of the witnesses. Her words were like a dagger in the air, causing the tension to increase by the minute. A woman sitting nearby suddenly pulled out her phone and quietly took a picture of the scene, not wanting anyone to notice. That action was not simply a recording, it was also an affirmation of an ignored truth. A contradiction that was being recorded, being witnessed. In the quiet cabin, the soft whispers became echoes, and the space began to be filled with an indescribable emotion, both sympathy and indignation, and above all, a hidden challenge to the invisible prejudices that still silently exist. In the dim yellow light of the passenger compartment, Ethan pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, his hand as steady as his body. The space seemed to quiet down, all the surrounding sounds faded away, giving way to his deep, calm, yet sharp voice. It was not just a normal call, but a declaration, an affirmation of the right to be respected in the very place where he belonged. Ethan's voice rang out with a thick layer of certainty and experience. "I am Captain Ethan Cole. I am being denied access to the training cockpit by Flight Attendant Karen Mills on AA-482. This is not only a violation of crew access, but also a clear sign of discrimination." Every word, every sentence was carefully chosen. Nothing was redundant or lacking. He did not need to shout because the truth had its own power. On the other end of the line, a calm but responsible voice rang out, a testament to the airline's seriousness. "We have received the information, Captain. We will handle it immediately." That answer was like an open door to hope, a guarantee that fairness was not just a distant ideal, but a must. Ethan listened, eyes still forward, not looking back, not needing anyone else's approval. He sighed lightly, hung up, without further comment, nor argument. His silence after the call was not resignation, but the quiet strength of someone who was not afraid to stand up for himself. Around him, the atmosphere gradually became heavy. All eyes began to realize that this was not a normal situation, but a silent struggle, where Ethan's words represented not only himself, but also many people who had been judged by the color of their skin instead of their abilities and true self. With each passing second, the lights on the cabin seemed to emphasize his loneliness, but resilience. A pilot who not only flies in the vast sky, but also fights for justice in an imperfect world. Time passed quietly. Space seemed to stop breathing before the footsteps of the person who came. Ethan stood there, his posture straight, unwavering, his eyes looking straight ahead, as if holding a separate space between the scrutinizing gazes and the unconcealed sighs. Suddenly, from the back of the cabin, the head flight attendant appeared with an airline representative. The man in a dark suit, his face as cold as ice, did not say a word before he walked to the scene of the incident. But his presence made the atmosphere heavier than ever. Without asking any further questions, the representative tilted his head slightly and whispered a few words to Karen, Those words were like invisible knives stabbing deep into the young girl's self-esteem. Karen's eyes changed color. Her once thick skin turned pale. Each word stuttered out as if trying to justify her actions. I was just trying to do a good job. I don't know. I don't think. But the agent, his voice low and firm like a final judgment, only replied, "And that's the problem." The cabin suddenly became so quiet that only the steady breathing of the passengers could be heard. Karen had no choice but to shrink back, no longer having the strength to argue or defend herself. She was asked to leave the plane, her steps trembling, but she still tried to keep her face calm, although her eyes betrayed panic and regret. The people around him said nothing. The silence was not only indifference, but also tacit agreement. A few passengers nodded slightly, as if to say that justice had finally been served, albeit late. They looked at Ethan with eyes full of respect, sympathy, and respect. Not only for him, but also for his resilience in standing upright in such a challenging moment. In the cabin, the noise outside gradually faded away, but in each person's heart, perhaps an unspoken question still echoed. What is the truth, and how will we face it in the coming days? In the quiet light of the business class cabin, once Karen had left and the door had closed behind her, the atmosphere seemed to have been adjusted by someone, no longer clouded by suspicion or arrogance, but replaced by something else. Somewhat silent, somewhat understanding. The head steward, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor but a clear confusion in his eyes, walked slowly towards Ethan, as if every step he took was an apology, not only for his colleagues' actions, but also for the silence he and so many others had kept for the past 10 minutes. Stopping in front of him, he bowed deeply. No excuses, no excuses, just a full bow, as if acknowledging that sometimes an apology doesn't require words, but rather a timely presence and the right amount of humility. Ethan stood up straight, without resentment or pride. He just nodded slightly, as if forgiving something bigger than the person standing before him. And it was at that moment, in the seemingly invisible silence, that the loudest sound came from the eyes of a black boy sitting in the fourth row on the left, who did not blink, looking at Ethan as if he saw something that books or adult teachings could never teach him. The quiet steadfastness of a man who did not need to shout to assert his worth. An older man, white hair and a sunburned face, rose from his seat in 1D and walked toward Ethan. He didn't say much, didn't care who he was, where he came from, or why he was being stopped. Because with what he'd just witnessed, those questions were no longer necessary. "Sorry about this, sir," he said, the husky voice of someone who'd lived long enough to know when he was witnessing something he shouldn't have. Ethan smiled slightly. Not a smile of comfort, nor a smile of pride. It was the smile of someone who understood that some battles are not won by fists or arguments, but by absolute calm in the midst of storms. "It's okay," he said softly, his eyes still on the boy. "There are things you don't have to shout to be heard." As the fuselage began to shake slightly under the pressure of takeoff, the business class cabin was enveloped in a strange silence, not the awkward silence of a few minutes ago, but a silence born of recognition, of the feeling that everyone had just witnessed something right. Ethan sat by the port window, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his eyes fixed on the white clouds drifting lazily outside. The early afternoon sunlight filtered through the double-glazed windows, reflecting softly on his cheeks, casting a quiet glow on the face of the pilot, a man who, without wearing a military rank or speaking harshly, could command the attention of the entire cabin with his calm presence and inimitable charisma. A moment later, as passengers began adjusting their seats, flipping through books, or closing their eyes for comfort, the new flight attendant, a young woman with a gentle face and a voice as soft as a breeze, came to Ethan. She didn't speak loudly, didn't show any obvious gratitude, just leaned in and whispered, as if her words were something sacred that no one else needed to hear. "I will always remember the way you handled this." In her gaze there was not only admiration, but also a sign of hope, that maybe in this profession, this person, this world, there were still people who could stand up without straining, who could speak up without shouting. Ethan turned his head, his eyes still as light as the clouds he had just seen outside, but his words were steely and steady. Strength is not in being loud. It is in being calm, when you know you are on the right side. He did not need to say anything more, because every word he uttered was an echo of a lesson that was silently spreading through every row of seats, through every silent and thoughtful gaze in the cabin. The story does not end with retaliation, nor with any mockery or triumph. It concludes with the completeness of a lesson, that courage is not about making noise, but about standing up quietly when no one else dares. That self-respect is not a placard we hold up, but an inner core that no one can take away. And that justice, when it truly exists, does not need to be shouted to be heard. It spreads itself, in the eyes of a boy, in the whispers of a young person, and in the memories of the passengers on that flight, like a clear melody in a cloudless sky. And if you were one of the passengers on that flight, what would you do when you witnessed it? Would you turn away, pretending not to see, or would you choose to stand on the right side, even if it was just a glance, a nod, or simply non-complicit silence? Because who knows, the moment you speak up or don't speak up could be the opening chapter in a story that someone else will carry with them for the rest of their life.